I've prepared some slides. So what I'm going to be looking at doing is essentially giving a bit of an overview in terms of how we want to cover the learning outcome 3, which is understand how to create lessons. And these tend to be, looking at the crucial aspect of how teaching process in higher education works. It serves as a roadmap for the instructor, trainer, teacher, tutor, lecturer, whichever word we may use to describe them. And it will provide a bit of a detailed roadmap for us to be able to guide this process of teaching and learning, in the classroom. In order to cover this, what I've got is a few deck of slides, which I'm going to be taking you through, and an instructional video, which we will look at, which will help us in, developing a bit of deeper understanding into the concept of creating lesson plans. So let's dive straight in. There is a video that I've got here which talks about how to create a lesson plan and what we should be putting in to look at this as a template. This is something that I will ask you to watch offline. It's a 6-minute instructional video from one of the teachers who has shared the best practices of how to create a lesson plan, keeping in mind and taking into account the needs and preferences of learners, very different type of learners in the classroom. Now, when we look at, in general, if I put it this way, that we talk about what is the process of lesson planning and why is it important. I think what we need to be able to do is understand this, that this particular process involves several parts in terms of taking it further. One, we need to be looking at defining objectives, and these objectives are setting basically a very clear path for us to be able to, include in what we are going to teach and deliver in the classroom. So these objectives are expected to be achieved by the students and should help them in gaining skills and knowledge by what you are actually teaching or imparting in the classroom or online. Then the lesson plan also helps us in selecting the best teaching methods that can be used to be able to, convey the subject matter when we are delivering effectively and making your delivery effective, essentially. This decision is essentially based on all the, pedagogical theories and obviously some of the best practices which have been specified by the Learning Sector Health Council, the Education Training Foundation, and are used to underpin some of the practices that we do and use in the higher education sector. We'll also be looking at lesson planning because it helps us in determining resources. These resources can essentially be used to identify what material, textbooks, multimedia equipment, or handouts and other activities would be required to be done or created in order to ensure that the delivery of teaching and learning is effective. We also can look at lesson planning to be helping us in structuring the content, and this can be organized in a logical sequence, thereby taking into account, how learners with prior knowledge can actually use what you're delivering and what you're using as teaching aids in terms of materials, resources to be able to further develop their skills and knowledge. We will also be looking at various theoretical frameworks, which could be such as constructivism and behaviorism, which will allow us to apply them in the educational context, thereby structuring it by using a lesson plan or maybe using one of the lesson plans for delivery in the classroom. And online. I typically say online because we teach and deliver everything online. So obviously part of the process of planning and obviously how we look at delivering is pretty much the same, whether we do in the classroom or whether we do it online. The blended component of it also allows us to interact face-to-face with you as the learner, and obviously thereby looking at helping impart, let's say the knowledge which is required from an aspect of, the content of teaching and learning. Now, lesson plan will also look at, being one of the tools which will allow us to look at assessment and feedback. And this process of assessment and feedback tends to also employ various different forms of methods, which could be, assignments, case studies, quizzes. It could be group discussions. It could be, activities that you normally do when you then record a witness statement. And this is a crucial part because feedback mechanisms are essentially crucial for evaluating the effectiveness of the teaching process. And that is something that we can gauge from how you planned the teaching side of things when we look at your lesson plan. And also, last but not the least, I think lesson plans are quite useful because they help in actually helping us to adapt and be flexible in terms of our delivery, thereby allowing us to adjust to the needs and preferences and demands of the students or learners and their unexpected questions or something that might come up. And that is where you would look at, apart from the planning that you've done, you should be able to then look at adapting and have a bit of flexibility in terms of delivering the subject matter that you planned, for the purposes of delivery on a particular day, given a particular lesson plan. So lesson plan tends to be very, very important activity as far as higher education is concerned, because it then defines a very systematic process through which you can integrate theoretical frameworks, objectives of the matter that you're trying to deliver, look at varying your teaching methods, look at different assessment strategies, and thereby looking at then using all this to structuredly and effectively deliver the content or the subject matter, thereby helping the learners gain experience and knowledge and skills from what you are teaching on that day. And these would also be aligning with the pedagogical principles and obviously looking at promoting teaching excellence as far as effective delivery and planning of the subject matter is concerned. Now, with that understanding in mind, let's go into some of the assessment criteria which are there, because let's dive straight in, and some of the assessment criteria which are there with regards to learning outcome 3. The first part that we look at is essentially talking about, I would say, how do we prepare an effective lesson plan? So here, when we look at the effective of lesson plan, what we need to be able to do is look at thinking about an approach that you will follow through in terms of ensuring that the delivery that you're doing is going to make sense and obviously, be meeting the requirements of your learners in the classroom. So when I look at that as an aspect, what we are looking at is how do you prepare, how do you assess prior knowledge, and what kind of instructional, let's say, design or methods that you're going to use to be able to teach and deliver in the class. So identifying the basic steps of lesson planning, I think something which I'd shown a couple of sessions earlier. What we look at is when we look at teaching for excellence, and we look at this particular slide that I'd shared, I think in the learning outcome 1 before we started this unit, talked about, what do you do in terms of preparation, in terms of lesson planning, before the class, during the class, and after the class. So when we look at feedback and assessment mechanism, that is something which comes after the class. During the class, you're actually planning things which are related to how you would teach and deliver the course or the content. And then prior to the class, you're looking at dwelling into the fact that what teaching methods you would use, what are the resources that you're going to be using, and the objectives that you'll be setting to meet when you are actually teaching and delivering, the sessions or the content in relation to, the subject matter that you are doing. So if we look at, going through that analogy of how do we look at planning, go about successfully planning to teach and deliver in class or in online situations or environment, then you're looking at all these activities that you're going to be looking at for the purposes of lesson planning. And they would be thinking at starting with defining the objectives, assessing any sort of prior knowledge which the learners would have. Then you'll choose an instructional approach which will be suitable for teaching the subject matter in a class. And for example, if I'm teaching biology, and in that biology subject area, I'm teaching about cell biology, then obviously some of the material resources and the things that I would need to have an effective lesson would be to look at having a microscope, some slides, maybe some charts which will show the division functions of cells, different types of cells. Visually, that will be more useful in terms of developing an understanding of the learners. But similarly, if I'm using or teaching mathematics in the class, say for example algebra, then in those cases using the whiteboard or interactive board to discuss examples, take some examples and create solutions for those examples, or look at a logical way of solving those equations would make more sense. And they would be then the material side of planning would be that I would need an interactive whiteboard. I might need some props. If I look at cell biology, I would need charts, posters, maybe equipment like microscope, slides to be able to then create that engaging experience with learners. And that is what you would need to look at in the process of doing lesson planning, that what would be the best particular methodology or method that you would use to be able to teach and deliver in the class. And that would help you engage with your learners and engage with your students so that they are participative, they are interactive, and they are able to then grasp the lesson, and thereby you are able to achieve the objective. So that part of it, if you think as a teacher, as a tutor, as a trainer, as an instructor, that what you're looking at doing and in terms of accomplishing in that particular lesson and delivery is what is going to be involved in preparing an effective lesson plan. So those are the steps that I've outlined here in a bit more detail, starting with developing an outline, preparing the teaching material and resources, looking at incorporating active learning strategies, looking at anticipating challenges that you might face in the class, which could be regards to certain topics. For example, when we do teach and deliver, students don't like those topics, or they have different perceptions about it. For example, sex education, when it happens in the schools, at a younger level, at a younger age, some students might not be very, forthcoming and look at that as a topic which might be a bit repulsive or might not be very conducive for them. And there are ways through which the teachers then can introduce this in the classroom, introduce this in the class while teaching, and then slowly and subtly gain the confidence of the learners to overcome those challenges which they might have, because they might have a closed mindset or maybe ignorant towards that particular area. Then you look at the assessment and evaluation of how the teaching and learning has gone across, and you normally use questions, quizzes, certain sort of activities which would basically confirm that what you've taught and delivered essentially has been understood by the students, and that is where your assessment and evaluation comes in. You could also have a plan for differentiation, wherein if there are students with different needs, then in those cases you're looking at essentially ensuring that you're able to adapt your sessions or lessons in a way that are meeting the that are taking into account the considerations and also meeting the requirements and needs of learners with disability or special requirements. And then towards the end, what we need to remember is that your lesson has, the reason of we wanting to do all this planning is to ensure that the lessons are effective, they are interactive, they are engaging, and they allow the learners to be able to learn and help you achieve the objectives of what you're trying to deliver as a subject matter, as far as this is concerned. So this would then essentially allow you to effectively prepare and then plan a particular lesson for a subject area that you're delivering. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Right. Now, let's look at a particular, what I want to do is also basically show you a couple of lesson plan or lesson planning templates. Now, there are quite a lot of them which are available, but what we want to be able to do is be able to use one of them which you think should be something which will be appropriate and something that you can customize to your workings. I'm just going to randomly show you a few. The reason I'm saying that is, depending on what you're teaching and in what subject area you're teaching, your lesson planning templates could be very varied, and it could be something that could be used out of the box, but you might need to customize it. You might need to ensure that they are meeting and serving the purpose, or they're fit for purpose essentially. And in those cases, you have to just keep in mind that the ones that you choose, you have to then look at customizing it over a point in time that meets your requirement and essentially the requirements of achieving the objectives of that particular lesson. So let me, before I move on, what I want to do is drag a few in terms of examples of lesson plan templates. And as I mentioned to templates, PLATES, right? As I mentioned to you, they could be something which could be relevant to different sessions or different types of subject areas that you're teaching. So I'm just dropping a few in for you to be able to see that, okay, this is what a lesson plan template should or would look like essentially when you are using them for the purposes of let's say, delivering and effectively delivering your side of teaching and learning. So I've just put a few here, which I think are quite, to give you an idea in terms of how and what they look like. They would typically have things, as I mentioned, related to, what are the lesson objectives, what are the resources you're looking at, how do you plan to introduce the session, and then looking at, feedback and assessment process. And last but not the least, you're also looking at dwelling into the fact that whether these sessions can be adapted and whether they will be flexible or not. Now, looking at the second assessment criteria, which basically talks about, looking at analysis of the need for flexibility and adaptability. This is the key part that we are looking at exploring in this particular assessment criteria, is that how can your lesson planning be dealing with, can be flexible, and how will it help you deal with adapt, let's say, changing situations in the classroom, or in other words, adaptability. How would you adapt your lessons if you feel there is an unexpected challenge which comes up, or if there are students with diverse needs in your classroom? So when we look at this as an example, what we are looking at is we're looking at the need for flexibility and adaptability in terms of, being able to design a lesson plan which could be relevant to the subject matter that you're delivering to a number of students, or in the class or online, as I say. Now, one of the things that you would need to look at, why do we need to have adaptability or flexibility, is that we need to make the learning student-centric. That's the first point I would put, that I would put it this way, that when I'm specifically teaching, like in this case, teaching on this particular course, one of my main objectives is to make sure that the learning and the delivery that I do is student-centric. That means it has, my planning of the lesson is done in such a way that it includes, various essentials of what the student needs to learn from this qualification. How are these lessons or sessions that I'm doing going to help you to learn and adapt, the knowledge that you've gained to be able to do the assignment towards the end of this particular unit. So for me, this is mostly student-centric learning. I'm going to take your needs, your demands, your preferences into mind in terms of when can you attend these sessions, what timings are suitable to you. And this is keeping in mind all student-centric learning requirements. The second thing that I would look at when I talk about flexibility and adaptability would be to ensure that I am actually looking at promoting engagement. I am looking at engaging with you and the session that I'm planning on doing. And this engagement that I'm looking at making is primarily to help you to be able to adjust to the content and the teaching methods or methodology that I'm using in real time. For example, in this case, I'm using Zoom meetings to be able to teach and deliver the sessions to you. What I want to do is promote engagement by allowing you to ask me questions, to ask queries, and towards the end, maybe use a quiz to check what I've delivered. Has that been understood? Has the lesson been effective? Has that delivery been effective? Or has that been able to create an impact which will allow you to gain knowledge and skills at the end of this session? The third point that I would put it this way that I'm looking at is I'm looking at meeting with diverse needs of the learners. That means I want to make sure that my lesson planning is coping with the needs of different types of learners, which could come from varying backgrounds. They have different levels of preparedness. Their knowledge and skill is different, depending on what they've learned prior to joining this qualification. And in some cases, what I'm also looking at is trying to look at accommodating for differences that may come into play because of the fact that they have had or they have come from different educational backgrounds. So in some cases, when I look at meeting the needs of flexibility and adaptability in designing lesson plans, I'm also looking at making sure I refer to individual learning plans. So ILPs, an important aspect in this particular case is because that is looking at individual needs. I need to be able to tailor instructions or activities to individual needs, which will allow you to come up and let's say bridge those gap areas in by conducting or doing those activities and thereby gaining a skill. And those different activities that I would support in the individual learning plan would be providing additional support to you for a specific learning need, or maybe to enhance or build a specific skill in which you are essentially lacking. Now, other things that I could look at why I need to have flexibility and adaptability is because I want to look at incorporating, say, technological enhancements. Sometimes when we go and do teaching, we have, we do plan our resources. We do clearly know what our requirements in terms of resources that we need to be able to effectively deliver or make the lessons engaging. But sometimes what we are also looking at is that because technology is rapidly evolving, we are also looking at technology making an impact on how the learning and learning experience are shaping up. So in this case, what we're looking at is when we look at the latest things like My School app, or when we look at the MICS systems in various schools today, which allow parents to get the updates on the activities of their children, in terms of updates on reports and the various activities that they do in school. These are technological enhancements which are happening, and sometimes we need to keep up as a teacher, as a tutor, instructor. We need to keep up with these advancements which are happening, and then use them to access up-to-date information and adapt it to be able to maybe take out or extract out components which are required for the purposes of including in our lesson planning. Now, some of the other points that I would look at in this particular criteria would be, when I say flexibility and adaptability, is one, we want to reflect on ensuring and reflecting on, assessment of data. That means lots of students who you teach, assess, manage during your delivery of class or subject matter in the classroom. You're also at some stage looking at assessments. That means you're looking at basically evaluating their performance to be able to see whether they are gaining the knowledge. And that is the ultimate feedback that the teacher would get if this class scores the best possible marks, or in some cases, they get the best possible grades. And that would also give you feedback that as a teacher need to maybe look at if, identifying the strengths and weaknesses, and also looking at adjusting my instructional strategy. Now, if I use presentation, and sometimes we use this word that by PowerPoint, now that might be very possible in some cases, because most of the teaching of content is done using PowerPoint presentations and electronic media nowadays in most settings. But use of the interactive whiteboard, allowing students to come up to the whiteboard or interactive board to do and participate in activities, asking them to look at addressing some of the areas by doing or involving them in activities, is also going to help you do different forms of assessment. Now, one such case could be that if an activity is being given to the student, what you could essentially do is break down that activity by putting students into a group. And in those cases, the activity presented by them, each of them individually then making a contribution to that activity, can be recorded by an observation report. And that would allow you to do individual assessments, although the activity has been assigned or given, as a combined group activity to the learner. So adaptability and flexibility would allow you in this case to become, or essentially, let's put it this way, enable you to meet the diverse need of students, and also promote engagement, and thereby overall enhancing the quality of education that you are trying to impart in class or online during your online session. So in practice, when I say responding to changes or changing circumstances that could be taken into account for the purposes of delivering of your content during teaching and learning, would be the main reason why you would need to look at analyzing the need for flexibility and adaptability in designing your lessons. And this is something which is also necessitated by the principles of the dynamic nature of higher education, and how they would contribute to the educational achievement of the or let me rephrase that, or basically the achievement of these goals, educational goals, which have been set as a part of the curriculum that you are delivering under, and as a member of the team within the school or within a particular educational setup. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Right. Now, this brings us nicely into the third and the last assessment criteria, which talks about explain how lesson plan design affects the delivery of inclusive teaching and learning. Now, one of the things that I want to look at is what is first inclusive teaching and learning. What is this concept of inclusive teaching and learning? Now, in order for us to understand this, when we talk about the concept of inclusive teaching and learning, what we mean by that is that in the context of specifically looking at higher education, we are looking to an approach, let me say an educational approach that recognizes and embraces the diversity of learners. That means inclusiveness means that we are looking at ensuring that all students are entitled to a learning experience that respects their diversity. It enables their participation. It removes any sort of a barrier or anticipates any sort of challenges that as a teacher, as a tutor, as an instructor, or as a lecturer, I can help remove, thereby ensuring that the learning happens in the class unabated. That means there are no hindrances to learning, and a variety of learning needs and preferences in a way can be incorporated in terms of what I'm trying to teach and deliver in the class. So this is inclusive learning. An inclusive classroom, a term which you would come across when I say inclusive teaching and learning. Where does it happen? It happens in an inclusive classroom. That means a classroom that features students from all in which students, let's say it features students of all learning styles and abilities. That means they are students which have pretty much different learning styles using the VARC style questionnaire. The classroom could be a mix of gifted students, auditory learners, visual learners, kinesthetic learners, learners with disabilities such as ADHD, or students who are disabled, say for example, maybe on a wheelchair, and in some cases students having some sort of special requirements. Now that would be a classroom which will be termed as what is called an inclusive classroom. Now, with that understanding in mind, how do we now design a lesson which looks at inclusive teaching and learning? So when we talk about that, what we are looking at is we are aiming to create an environment where all students, regardless of their background and abilities or learning preferences, can fully participate and achieve their potential. And that would be the goal of creating an inclusive lesson planning that we will do. Now, let's look at how do I elaborate this in terms of teaching and learning using, say, certain resources. So an example of this would be sometimes what we do is I'm going to be looking at creating a lesson plan which will address diverse learning needs. That means I will have students who will have different types of styles through which they learn. It could be visual, auditory, kinesthetic, VARC style that we look at. And in doing so, what I will do is I will include resources for the purposes of my instructions or for the purposes of delivery in such a way that I'm able to engage and include everyone to be able to use some of those resources for the purposes of learning. For example, I might use handouts, I might use a group activity, I might use multimedia resources like a PC or an interactive whiteboard or a projector. And in some cases, I might also design activities which might be suitable for auditory, kinesthetic, or visual learners. So maybe using slides to show on the interactive screen, sometimes giving handouts to learners who would be looking at a different style, and this would thereby allow students to engage and participate in all the activities, thereby creating an inclusive classroom. Now, the other point that I would look at in general would be looking at differential instructions. Now this, when I say differential instructions, is I would be looking at incorporating strategies to meet all the types of learner needs. That means I would have content, which I normally deliver through a PowerPoint, but in this case, because I have learners who have disability or special needs, that I would include or basically look at creating handouts first, or maybe activities or quizzes, which I think would be more useful to be able to grasp that particular lesson and or that concept that I'm teaching today. And that would allow me to appropriately deal with challenges that will be served up because of the needs of diverse learners in the classroom. And in doing so, what I would essentially do is break the class down into different groups and then engage them with the different form of activities which would make them feel that they are, obviously involved, and in some cases also tailoring instructions to ensure that they are able to understand and comprehend what is being taught on that particular day as per my lesson plans objectives which have been set. So when we look at how do we look at designing effective lesson plans which will include or which will be inclusive of various teaching and learning needs, we will also look at building on things like explaining value of diversity, for example, or in some cases looking at making sure that some of the needs of learners are identified prior to the start of the session, and then resources or material are allocated or asked for before the session actually begins. And this would allow you to look at delving into prior knowledge of the learner in terms of the special requirements or needs that they have. And this in turn would allow you to create an inclusive lesson with involving, inclusive lesson or a classroom, thereby involving all learners within the class to be able to engage and interact with you during the sessions. Now, the other bits that we look at, which will be, slightly repetitive, would be the fact that when we look at inclusive teaching and learning, we are looking at obviously taking feedback from all the learners or, from all the students in the class, which would allow you to essentially identify which parts of your session went well, which parts of your session did not do that well, or which part of the session did not create any traction with our learners, and thereby, allowing you to get feedback on what could be the effective ways through which you could, deal with the diverse set of learners need in the classroom when you do the next session or when you do the next lesson, as far as the subject area is concerned. Now, in some cases, you would also allow students to demonstrate their understanding and skills, and this would be done by use of certain activities and their abilities appropriate to their learning styles, thereby ensuring that you're giving fair and equal treatment to most of the learners, depending on their condition and their requirements in the class. And that would also be inclusive teaching and learning. Sometimes we'll also look at some of the points like, collaboration and peer interaction. We might also look at, fulfilling learners' needs, and this is to ensure that different students have different learning needs, and they all have to be met in order for us to ensure that the whole class moves ahead or the objectives of learning for that particular lesson are met. So in some cases, group learning, cooperative learning activities and discussions which can be incorporated as a plan to provide. Sometimes what do I do is, if I do with the English jargon, I know that in my class there are learners which are excellent, in my class there are learners which are good, which are average, and then some of them are poor. So what I would want to do is, when I talk about collaboration and peer interaction, I'm going to group some of the learners together. So I'm going to group the excellent learners with the good learners, good with the, and do a mixture wherein I'm going to average learners with excellent learners, good with poor learners. And that would allow maybe a diverse perspective to happen in the class, wherein I would want inclusive participation. And this would also mean that learners would be able to help each other to bring up some of the skills or some of the bits that they feel that they are weak in. So I wouldn't group somebody who's very good with somebody who's excellent, because of the fact that this would obviously disadvantage some of the other learners in the class. And thereby what I would do is try and do some sort of equal groupings or, capability equal groupings, which will allow the whole class to be engaged and interact in a positive manner to be able to complete that activity or achieve that, objective on that day. Now, having lesson plans which are inclusive would also allow for flexibility and responsiveness. And when I say this, what I mean by that is that when you have lesson plans which are inclusive, they will allow you to be flexible to also take into account the evolving needs of the students. That means teachers can continuously monitor the progress, can readjust or adjust their instructional strategies, and that would allow them to support the students by looking at personal. So the term that I would use is that would allow teachers to basically provide personalized support. They could also look at being a bit more accommodating in challenging cases wherein the requirements are a bit, different from some of these other learners in the class. And last but not the least, this will also ensure that when you are progressing learners and you're, taking them along, you're also not only just fulfilling your objectives for that particular session, or in this case, the lesson, but you're also ensuring that overall you're making progress on the curriculum and you are not leaving any learner behind in terms of in terms of being incapable or in being weak in terms of completing or achieving that objective or that activity. So in summary, what I would suggest is that lesson plan design can greatly influence the delivery of teaching and learning, and to make it inclusive. So when we look at inclusive teaching and learning in higher education in particular, the aim is to create an inclusive and diverse learning environment that caters to needs of all students, promoting equitable and equitable educational outcomes. That means, to be fair, you are looking at making sure that everyone progresses. You're looking at making sure that everyone to its capability and its to their caliber is able to then participate in the conducive environment, and thereby they would need to look at achieving the aims and objectives, thereby achieving success. And you as a tutor, instructor, teacher, lecturer would be then looking at ensuring that the educational outcomes are met, and thereby ensuring that all learners are able to progress within the classroom. And that would be the concept of inclusive, concept of learning lesson plan design that affects, and is appropriate for creating an inclusive, teaching and learning environment, or an inclusive teaching and learning classroom. So I hope this bit has been useful in terms of the session, and helps you to understand the actual practical aspect of lesson planning, and the main aspect of this being able to essentially use it, effectively use it as a tool to create a lesson plan which is meeting which is adaptable and obviously flexible to include and meet the needs of diverse learners. At the same time, also looks at creating an inclusive classroom for teaching and learning. I'm going to meet up obviously with you tomorrow as well in order to cover learning outcome 4. Until then, I would suggest if you have any questions or queries, feel free to drop me an email and I will come straight back to you. A copy of this presentation and the recording, along with these templates of some of the lesson plans, are available up on Moodle, which you can refer to for more knowledge, for more reading and obviously knowledge. Thanks so much for joining, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye for now.